American Community Media Weekly National Briefing. I'm Sunita Sarabji, your moderator for today and co-producer of our weekly news briefings with my colleague Pilar Marrero. As we come online this morning, the Texas State Senate is taking a vote, and they may actually have finished the vote. I didn't get to check in the last 10 minutes on newly drawn congressional district maps with the aim of picking up 5 Republican seats during the midterm elections. Governor Gavin Newsom announced last week that California would counter Texas' move by redrawing its own congressional districts to favor Democrats. These trigger maps will go before voters on November 4th, and the California State Legislature is also considering these maps as we speak. This is not the normal process. Congressional district maps are usually drawn once every 10 years after the census to reflect changing demographics. And California will be bypassing its independent redistricting commission for the first time in 15 years. So to unpack all of this for us, we have an esteemed group of panelists. Please help me welcome Representative Jean Wu, Democratic leader in the Texas House of Representatives, Sarah Rouhani, Assistant Counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Thomas Sains, President and General Counsel at MALDEF, and Sam Wang, the President of the Electoral Innovation Lab at Princeton University. We asked reporters to enter questions in the chat. We will attempt to address as many as we can immediately after each speaker presents. And so we begin with Representative Jean Wu, who will discuss what's next for Texas in the redistricting battle and his call for action for all blue states to redraw their maps to counter Republican efforts. Welcome, Representative Wu.
Thank you so much. Oh, wait, hold on. Put my mic off for a second. Hi, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate being part of this. I know this has been a long, I don't know for you, but this has been a very, very long journey for me. Started about almost, I guess, 4 weeks ago when word that we were going to have a special session and working through that and then ending up with a 2-week quorum break in Illinois and going all around the country, visiting multiple states, talking about this issue and starting up a national interest. If I look more exhausted than normal, it's because I also spent the last 3 days being kept to the floor of the House because I was accompanying Nicole Collier as she protested our arrests and protested our detention. And we stayed on the House floor for, I think, over 48 hours. And we fought the bill. They eventually passed it, and we showed everyone exactly what these people are like. That they're willing to use force, they're to use threats and intimidation, anything they have at their disposal to get what they want. And to make it short, what they want is to cheat, because they know that the policies that are happening right now that are causing massive price increases across the board, coffee, grains, all these items have doubled in price in the last few months. And they're still going up. There's no signs of slowing these price increases down. People are soon to lose their jobs. It's not just government workers. People all over are losing it. Tourism is down by 50% in many areas. Many businesses simply cannot stay open. And these policies are just beginning. This is just the beginning of this. We're headed straight into one of the probably worst recessions we've seen in a long time. And Republicans know that they are solely to blame because it is their policies and their blind support of Donald Trump that is causing it. There is no other explanation. And they know this is happening, so they decided that the only way that they could survive is to cheat. Because the census says we're supposed to redistrict after we know new population numbers. Here, we're in between 2 census. The only other time that this was done was also in Texas, and back then they called it cheating too. But back then, the response from everyone else was, well, we just hope they won't do it again. Because of that, now people feel free to do it all the time. Texas is going to do it. Missouri says they're going to do it. Other places says they're going to do it. Here's the problem. If this is allowed to happen across the board, if every state, whether they're red or blue, if they do this every single time after every election to make sure that they never lose, then politicians and leaders will no longer listen to the people. Because why? Why do you need to listen when you're guaranteed to win every time? There will be no democracy left. It would no longer matter what we want. For the minority community, for small communities, this is even more important, because the reason they're doing this is because of minority communities, because minority communities in Texas and in other places have grown in power. And because they've grown in power, now they're a threat to them. And so many of these communities, including here in Houston, in South Texas, in Dallas, they're taking minority communities that have built power over time, and they're hacking them apart so that they cannot be powerful anymore. This is a real threat to our area and to our community. And I hope you take this fight seriously. I'm happy to answer questions later.
Thank you. Representative Wu, first question for me. Can you point out some very egregious examples of gerrymandering within the state?
Sure. The easiest is what they're doing in Congressional District 18 and 9. So these are two large, separate African-American communities who have built up power over time. The African-American community makes up about 40% of the voters in that district. And because of that, because they're 40%, it's more than enough people to sway most elections and to control most primaries. And so they almost always get the voter of their choice. Whoever unites behind them usually wins, almost always. And in Congressional District 18, you have famous voices such as Barbara Jordan, Mickey Leland, Sheila Jackson Lee, Sylvester Turner. Right? In District 9, that's Congressman Al Green's district, another district that elects a powerful Black leader. And what they're going to do is called packing. If you have two large communities, what you can do is you can narrow them down to one. You took two large African communities and forcibly push them together. So though now they're going to have an 80% concentrated Black community, right? And so that instead of electing being able to elect two Black officials to represent their needs, now all that entire Black community can only elect one, right? And so and in Latino communities, they're doing what's called fracking. In South Texas and in Dallas, what they're taking Latino communities that have built up power over time, but they're more spread out. And we'll take this one chunk over here and push them into a majority white area, and so that their voices will no longer matter. We'll take this chunk over here and push them into this majority white area, and so that their voices won't matter either. They can vote all they want. They'll never be able to change the outcome of any election. Right? That's called fracking. So both are different ways to deny communities their ability to select who they want. So what this results in is a system where if you're a white community member, if you're Caucasian, you have one representative who's white in Texas for every about 400,000 Anglo voters. If you're Latino, you have one for about every 1.5 million Latinos. If you're African American, it would take almost 2.5 million Black people in Texas to elect one Black congressional member.
That's alarming. The first question comes from Irene Diaz-Bazan. Irene, please ask your question.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Yes, I'm trying to find my question because I did twice. Okay. Yeah, the first one is How may partidism restricting efforts in states like Texas and California reshape representation in Congress, and what risks do they pose for minority voting power?
So this actually has the most implication for minority voters, because even outside of Democrat versus Republican, we have other considerations like rural versus urban. Are you city or are you farm? But even within a city, you might have different factions. Say, I am minority, but I am Latino. I am minority, I am Latino, but I am also Venezuelan, right? Those are not necessarily all the same interests. And if minority communities get moved around and put into areas where they have no power, not only do you not have the ability to say, well, we have a special interest for people in the city, but not just people in the city, but Latinos from Venezuela are that we want to have different respect for our community. We want different things for our community. We need different things for our community. And if you're shoved into an area that has no immigrants, no Latinos, and you're the only group out there, who cares? No one would care. But if you're at least in a group area where there are other Latinos can stand up and say, hey, we're Mexican, but we want the Venezuelans to have some attention too, right? And then the people in the city, all immigrants, and say, hey, we're not all the same immigrants, but we want them to have power too.
Absolutely.
Mr. Fantini has the next question. Nestor, please ask your question.
Yes, thank you, Representative Wu. My question is, and let me read it. In California, Governor Newsom has suggested a fighting fire with fire. It's an approach, of course, towards gerrymandering in this case. Given that Republicans currently hold full control of the legislature and governorship in 23 states, compared to only 15 for Democrats, is this tactic appropriate, or could it end up backfiring and strengthening the Republican dominance?
Yeah.
And Representative Wu, before you answer that question, Henrietta Burrows has a similar question, and perhaps you can take both of them. Henrietta, could you please ask your question as well?
Thanks so much, Sunita. Isn't this all going to backfire for the Republican Party, even in the redistricted areas? For example, you mentioned the devastating effect on the economy. And I'm wondering, when the next elections come, isn't there also the assumption, if the economy is going to be that bad, that everybody's going to vote along racial lines? It seems to me that if the economy really goes down that much in Texas, that people will be voting along the lines of their economic interests more so than of their ethnicities.
Correct. So those are both really, really good questions and really, really complicated questions. Let me take it apart piece by piece. So one, yes, there is a possibility that the Republicans could get too greedy and actually hurt themselves in doing so. We call this dummy mandering, right? Instead of gerrymandering, it's dummy mandering. DUMMY. Basically saying that you got so greedy while you're trying to gerrymander that you made the districts too thin, that you gave the majority, you thought there was enough majority Republicans in one side to carry the district, but you drew it thinner and thinner. You drew it thinner and thinner because you were trying to do more districts. So if in Texas, the Republicans wanted to make one new, for sure, 100% guaranteed Republican district, they could. If they want to take those same numbers and make two guaranteed districts, it gets a little, I don't know. Could 3, 4, 5? Each one that you add in, you have to make the margins a little smaller because there's only so many people out there that are voting. And I think, I'm not here to tell them what to do, and I'm not going to correct their mistakes. But I would be very careful using 2020 or 2024 voting numbers. I think the public is going to have a very, very different reaction. They're making a lot of these assumptions based on the idea that Latinos are going to continue voting for Republicans, and that Asians are going to continue voting for Republicans. That all these groups are so up and down the line that voted Republican briefly in 24 because of Trump. I'm not here to tell them what to do, but I would not have based my numbers on those numbers. I would not have based my decisions on those numbers. But here's the thing. And so the other part of this question is, what if everybody does this, what will be the result? Well, if every single state that could right now artificially redraw their lines, and let's say that the courts didn't change it and didn't force them to change, there would be, like I've heard experts say, it could anywhere between +2 Democrats to +3 Republicans. So a 5-point swing either way out of hundreds of seats. That's actually still a Cold War situation where everybody fires their missiles, and at the end, both sides basically lose, or basically go back to the exact same place that they started out with. That's completely possible. Hold on.
Interesting.
And
please go on.
And I want to be very clear that these are not equivalent. So what is happening in Texas is not what is equivalent to what's happening in California. In Texas, our gerrymandering is based on race, because in Texas, race is so closely tied to partisanship that you cannot avoid it. You cannot remove Democratic voters and mess up Democratic voters without messing with racial lines. In California, that is not the same thing, okay? Texas's maps have been found to be illegal, to be unconstitutional, to violate the Voting Rights Act of 1975 every single time since 1975, right? Texas has been in violation every single time. California has not, right? Texas is doing an illegal mid-cycle gerrymandering. California is putting up a trigger. California says, we will draw these maps and leave them over here above you. And nothing will happen as long as you do not create mid-cycle maps, right? As long as you do not do the bad thing, nothing will happen. And our maps are held on by this rope. As long as you don't cut the rope, everything will be fine. And so right now, what happens in California is up to Texas, right? Those are not the same things. Russia and Ukraine are not equivalents, right? Russia attacked Ukraine. Ukraine is defending itself. Those are not the same thing. California and Texas are not the same things. California is defending the nation. Texas is doing something illegal.
Thank you. Will you take one more question from
Yes,
Ritu
I'm happy to
Marwa?
take as many questions as
Okay.
you want.
Ritu, please ask your question.
Hi. I'm kind of curious as to why the Democrats are saying that the changes will be made, the changes in the districts will have effects for decades.
Yes.
If this can be changed in 5 years, you can change it back in 5 years as well.
The problem is that this kind of change in representation has long-lasting effects. Don't forget, the Congress is not just a member of Congress. They don't just vote on stuff. These are also people who get your community things. So if your community is on the final legs of getting a project for a new community center, and it needs that last little bit of federal money, that federal money suddenly is saying the money is cut off, right? Mm-hmm. Your community center that's been planned for the last 10 years goes back to zero. Mm-hmm. Right? It doesn't just like restart in a few years. It goes back to zero and has to restart. All these things will have long-lasting effects. How your community is funded, whether your community gets money for a hospital, for a school, for all these things. If those are not in place, it doesn't just have an effect for those periods. It will affect the community from then on. It will have effect that ripples outwards. right?
Right.
Because the
Right.
entire point is to make sure that these areas nobody cares what they want. Nobody will care what any of these communities want, and they will not service them. They will not get the money. They will not bring money from DC. Like people talk about pork from Washington, D.C. Pork from Washington, D.C. is bad for everyone else, but it's really good for the people in this area.
Right.
Because those are jobs, those are investments, those are new buildings, right?
I see. I understand now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative Wu. Please stick around for a final round of questions if you can. And there are several questions for you in the chat. If you could answer them there, that would be great. We move next to Dr. Sam Wang of the Electoral Innovation Lab to go into a greater detail about what redistricting efforts across the country actually mean for our nation. Welcome, Dr. Wang.
Hi, thanks for having me. Let me, in the brief time I have, try to couch this a little bit broadly and lay out some principles that may be a little bit different from how people on this call typically think about voter rights or about how communities get represented. Democracy is this complex interplay of all these different rules. Representative Wu is quite knowledgeable about these, and sorry, I just have to cancel that. I do not want any messages while I'm on my call. Sorry, I was asked about my speaking language, which I hope someone else will enter as English. And the difficulty is that these are governed by a combination of federal principles and state laws, and in many cases precedents set by the Supreme Court, which is in some sense a set of laws that is above all the other laws. And I think any observer of voting rights has seen that all of these voting rights are undergoing great change, and many would say from a racial fairness standpoint are under attack. In the case of redistricting, congressional redistricting is unusual in two ways. First, representation in Washington is the sum of all the representatives from all the different states. But at the same time, redistricting is governed by the laws of all 50 states separately. You might imagine that in a rational world, there would be a national standard for partisan gerrymandering, and there would be standards for racial fairness in redistricting, and then they would be applied evenly across the states. That is not the case. I'll give you an example. The Supreme Court has said that partisan redistricting is unconstitutional, but they have also declined to do anything about it. So this doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but that's just the way it is. And that's a case called Rucho versus Common Cause from 2019. The reason that we're seeing such diverse responses in these different states is that in Texas, there are no state laws governing redistricting whatsoever. It is truly the Wild West. And as a consequence, the only recourse available to Texas legislators on the Democratic side is to deny quorum. And that happens to be the one leverage point that they have, which is why we've seen what we've seen. It has the political advantage from their point of view of creating a spectacle that's highly visible that allows them to get their message out and increase awareness. And of course, one thing that's going on now is that partisan gerrymandering is now, and gerrymandering in general, is attracting public attention in a way that it hasn't in decades. So I've worked on this topic for several decades, and I can tell you that right now my inbox is on fire, whether it be on, whatever, PBS or BBC or European television or Chinese television and so on. So on the other hand, in California, redistricting is written into the state constitution. And so as a result, the only way to change redistricting in California is for voters to vote. And so one general answer to a lot of people on this call is that in order to understand what can be done about voting rights, roughly speaking, unless Congress passes a law which requires them to start being more functional in the area of voting rights, the only answer is to work at the state level. So there are three general ways that redistricting can be made more fair. One is to implement an independent redistricting commission, as there is in California. That's the law in Michigan, Colorado, Arizona, other states. And so that is one recourse. About half of the states have a way for citizens to modify the Constitution. Another is for courts to step in. The constitutions and laws of every single one of the 50 states have some protection for voting rights, whether it be free and fair elections, or protecting freedom of association, or equal justice under law. And in each case, fair districting can be addressed in state courts, not federal courts, under those laws. And in some states, racial issues specifically can be addressed by things like the New York Voting Rights Act and the California Voting Rights Act. And so the point being that this is complicated, it's got a few different levels. And so although often we may be very interested in economic well-being or the interests and the well-being of a particular community group, that's the output that we care about as citizens. Yet at the legal level, where to apply pressure and where to work is highly dependent on state by state. And I'd be happy to correspond with people on that. If you go to samwang.substack.com, I write about these issues often, and I've written several law articles that describe what can be done state by state. To put this into perspective, what's happening right now, the Texas gerrymander that's about to be enacted in Texas is about 5 to 7 more seats than what would come up during a neutral process. That's because the Texas congressional map was already a gerrymander and is now gerrymandered further by 3 to 5 seats. And so that turns out to be the only time that 5 seats have been gained above a neutral baseline in all of the modern age of voting rights since 1972. And what that means is that Texas is now has the dubious honor of having basically the most extreme congressional gerrymander in the history of voting rights. And so, and honestly, California is about to come in a close second, and these 2 states represent a low point. The good news is that since 10 years ago, there's actually been nationally progress in gerrymandering. Gerrymandering reached a low point in 2012, and a wave of legislation, voter initiatives, state court rulings have made gerrymandering less of a problem than it was 10 years ago. But it is nonetheless the case that gerrymandering still reduces competition. One person wanted to know why vote under these circumstances. I will say that there are more competitive districts than there were 10 years ago. And the gerrymander in Texas does not affect voting rights in, say, Pennsylvania or Virginia or Michigan or New Jersey, where I live. And so generally speaking, there's a powerful reason to vote, which is to vote at the state representative level and also at the congressional level. These are places where there are competitive districts. And broadly, the most effective thing that citizens can do is advocate with their local representatives at the state level to do whatever they can to enhance voting rights locally. Because as I said, all of these, this representation in Washington arises from the actions in all the 50 states. And what that means is that wherever you're reporting, it would be often in your interest to go consult authorities on local election laws and the state constitutions within your state and to find out what's going on there. There's much more that I could say, but I think in the interest of time, I'd rather pause there and see if anyone has questions spurred by what I've told you so far.
There are a number of questions for you, but I have the first question, Dr. Wang, and I asked this to you yesterday during our pre-brief. I think there is a lot of confusion as to what happens once the California state legislature determines what it's going to do. Are these maps that they're drawing now going to immediately go into effect, or do they only go into effect after the November 4th special election? Newsom has framed these as trigger maps, and I think I struggle to understand what that means along with others. So if you could explain that for us, that would be great.
In California, the current law, which is written into the state constitution and cannot be overridden by Governor Newsom, is that an independent citizens commission does the job of drawing lines. So in states like Texas, politicians choose their voters through drawing lines. In California, voters choose their politicians by drawing lines. And that independent commission comes together once a decade, like a jury, convenes, takes input, decides what to do, draws lines, and they are done for the next 10 years. What Governor Newsom is proposing is to change the Constitution temporarily to override that process until the next time the commission meets. And that override is triggered by Texas's action. But because it's in the state constitution, the voters have to approve it. Broadly speaking, the principle generally is that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land nationally. Laws are subsidiary to that, and the president is subsidiary to that, despite what you may be seeing in the news. And likewise, in the state of California, Gavin Newsom and the legislature are subject to the state constitution and state laws, and they may not in general break those laws. And so the reason that Californians are going to vote in November is that they are going to decide what to do about congressional maps for the next 4 years.
Understood. That was very clear. Thank you. Sasha Wedner has the first question. Sasha? And after that is Minzi Zhu.
Sorry about that. I was trying to unmute. I had a bunch of questions, but
Please ask one.
I just wanted to start off with the first one, which was how has partisan gerrymandering affected elections in the past? For example, the 2024 election.
So, broadly speaking, there is not that much competition in congressional elections because people choose to live in neighborhoods and communities where they often are surrounded by people who think similarly to them politically. And so I would say about 80% of congressional districts in the United States would not be very competitive, even if they were drawn according to a neutral process. And in those 80% of districts, it's the primary election that matters. And so to the extent that one would want to make sure that one were represented fairly, one would turn to the primary election as a way of getting some measure of representation. In the last 10 years, gerrymandering has gone down, which I may have mentioned, because of independent commissions and court rulings. Competitive elections in the United States for Congress are more often found in states that have independent commissions. And those states are Arizona, California, Colorado, Michigan, Virginia, and some other states I'm sure I'm forgetting because I'm in August mode at the moment. But there's about half a dozen states with independent commissions, and they are able to draw districts independently. While we're on the subject, I should say the number of relatively competitive elections is much higher than it was 10 years ago. The other thing I'll say is just to cherry pick a question out of the comments. Often when people are interested in racial fairness, whether it be Black, Hispanic, or smaller groups such as Asian or Native American groups, often the better place to pursue representation is at the level of state legislative line drawing. And the reason for that is that many of those communities are not necessarily abundant enough or live in a pattern that makes it easy for them to draw a district. And so even though congressional redistricting is glamorous and gets all the press, it has a sibling that is less glamorous, but actually does a lot of work in representing communities, and that's state legislative line drawing. And we can see this because, as an example, there was a North Dakota lawsuit concerning Native American representation there, and that was very important.
Alvin Galloway, will you ask your question next?
Okay, I unmuted. My question is, with the continuous attack of the Voting Rights Act by the Republican Party, will we see the nation going back to days where Blacks and other people of color have to take various tests, like how many bubbles are in a soap bar, or how many jelly beans are in a jar? Do you see us moving to an era where we're going back as a nation?
Well, there's certainly no denying that I would say voting rights in many ways peaked in the 1990s. It was really, we didn't know how good we had it at the time. It's like that movie, The Matrix, which is based on the claim that human civilization peaked in 1995 or 1999. And so in many ways, voting rights was at its apogee at that time. The way I would put it is this. The swing votes on the United States Supreme Court are currently Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett. And I'm just going to say that as a fact without making any inferences from that. But I will say that certain kinds of things like literacy tests are relatively unlikely. The kinds of things that we're likely to see, I will tell you that the number one thing to watch in the next year is going to be Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So the Voting Rights Act is gone from being nearly unanimously renewed on a bipartisan basis back in the 1980s to being radioactive for one entire political party. And as the two political parties have polarized along race, where white nationalists have a pretty prominent voice in the Republican Party, obviously many voting rights are under attack. But at the same time, there are certain kinds of tests that seem unlikely to occur, like literacy tests. That having been said, things like mail-in voting are now on the block, which is somewhat shocking to me. And of course, things like racial gerrymandering. I think it's entirely possible that racial gerrymandering may be making a comeback in the next few years.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. There are a number of questions for you in the chat. If you could answer those there, that would be great. We now move on to Sarah Rohani from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, who will discuss the impact of the redrawn maps on the Black vote and the potential for diluting a significant voting bloc along with a Supreme Court decision. Welcome, Sarah.
Good afternoon. It's great to be with all of you, and thank you, Dr. Wang, for the segue. So I'm going to go back in time just a little bit, start with the census, and provide some background of the federal landscape. The 2020 census results revealed that Black populations were increasing while white populations were decreasing, including in key jurisdictions where the Legal Defense Fund has worked for decades. And the data was really clear. The population growth in this country over the last decade has been driven by voters of color, and new electoral maps should reflect greater electoral opportunities for Black voters and other voters of color. But with this being the first redistricting cycle without preclearance, a predictable and unfortunate pattern emerged. So states were evading their constitutional and statutory duties when they engaged in post-2020 census map drawing. And as background, a little over 12 years ago, in 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a ruling in Shelby County versus Holder that severely weakened a crucial section of the Voting Rights Act. And so by declaring that preclearance framework unconstitutional, which was a framework that identified which states, which localities with defined histories of racial discrimination in elections were required to obtain approval before implementing any proposed voting process changes, including new maps. So with that, the court opened the door for a bevy of suppressive voting laws and racial vote dilution tactics that have severely harmed Black voters in this country. And preclearance was an enormously successful requirement and arguably one of the most transformative provisions of the most successful civil rights law in American history. And discriminatory voter suppression laws were stopped before they even began. And eligible Black voters experienced really unprecedented access to the ballot box. And now for this redistricting cycle, the first without these full protections, this meant just as a practical matter that discriminatory maps proposed by previously covered states would not be scrutinized either by the Department of Justice or a 3-judge panel in the District Court of DC before they were enacted. So in this cycle, during the legislative sessions, LDF, along with community members and allies, provided testimony, provided maps, and other materials urging that elected officials comply with their duties under both the Voting Rights Act and the U.S. Constitution. And so Black voters throughout the country fought for years to be fairly recognized, fairly represented, and really just be heard, and actively warned that proposed maps in certain states would have a discriminatory impact on voters of color. But consistent with an American tradition, those warnings were either ignored or downplayed by majority white legislatures. And when those legislators failed to heed the warnings and follow federal law, litigation was really the only tool available. So civil rights groups and pro-democracy groups sued to challenge these discriminatory maps as they were enacted. Now, because of those federal lawsuits, district courts blocked racially discriminatory maps in several states. And for my purposes, I'm going to focus really on statewide maps. So in Alabama, in Florida, in Georgia, in South Carolina, Louisiana, and other states. But today, in 2025, we're still involved in ongoing litigation over many of those maps. And as just two examples, both Alabama and Louisiana's congressional and state legislative maps are still being litigated. So Alabama passed a congressional map that several courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Allen versus Milligan, found unlawfully diluted the voices of Black voters. But in response to that, Alabama refused to draw a congressional map that reflected the makeup of their state. Alabama defied court orders in order to deny Black voters even the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice in an additional district, which is what the Voting Rights Act provides. But the court did step in, and in 2024, elections proceeded under a map, a court-ordered map that finally reflected the real promise of the Voting Rights Act and included these two Black districts in which Black voters had a real hope of fair representation. And then just this past May, a few months ago, a federal court ruled after a full trial that the 2023 congressional map Alabama passed not only violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, but was also enacted by the legislature with a racially discriminatory intent. And so that ruling established that Alabama's congressional map has to include 2 districts where Black voters have the opportunity to elect candidates of their choice for the remainder of this decade. And even after Alabama lost, the state of Alabama lost at the Supreme Court and lost twice at the district court level, they have actually again appealed to the US Supreme Court and are now directly challenging whether Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is even constitutional. So just staying on the Supreme Court for a moment, this time I want to just focus
Sarah, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but could you just explain to us on what basis they're challenging Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act? I think that's an important question, and I hate to interrupt, but if you could just explain that, that would be great.
Yeah, that's not a problem at all. So Alabama is questioning, well, their argument is whether or not Congress had the power to enact Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act under the Constitution. And that does actually sort of tie into the next case that I wanted to talk about, which also is bringing a separate argument against the constitutionality of Section 2, which is our case in challenging the Louisiana congressional maps. And in this case, we successfully sued under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and it led to the creation of a second majority Black district, congressional district in Louisiana. And in this case, 7 judges, 2 panels of the Fifth Circuit, and the district court all determined that Louisiana's congressional map, where Black voters were packed, as Representative Wu described, into a single majority Black district, likely violated Section 2. But different from Alabama, rather than defy court orders, the Louisiana legislature called a special session to implement their own political objectives while also complying with federal law, and enacted a map, which, among other things that they took into consideration, provided a voice to Black voters from Shreveport to St. Landry for the first time in decades. But almost immediately after that, the state passed that map, and you can see a consistent pattern, which is why we're in 2025 still litigating. That map was challenged as a racial gerrymander by a group of plaintiffs that describe themselves as non-African American. So a racial gerrymandering challenge, different from a Section 2 challenge, this argues that Louisiana used race in an unjustified, predominant way in drawing that district. So LDF, we intervened in this lawsuit now on the other side as defendants in order to, so on the same side as the state of Louisiana, in order to actually defend the creation of this second majority Black district. And unfortunately, after a short trial and failing to really follow binding Supreme Court precedent, a 3-judge panel in that case issued a divided opinion agreeing with the plaintiffs that the district was a racial gerrymander. And to add another little interesting legal wrench, because this is a 3-judge panel that involves a constitutional challenge to a statewide map, that appeal goes directly to the Supreme Court. So my brilliant colleague Stuart Nafee presented oral argument at the Supreme Court in this case last term in March, and a faithful application of Supreme Court precedent should have vacated the decision in Calais. It was a straightforward case, but the 3-judge panel, committed legal errors in its racial gerrymandering assessment, and there were also, factual errors and factual determinations. And we really had been expecting a decision by the end of the court's term in June. But instead, on the last day of opinions, we were notified that the case was going to be set for re-argument. Now, this does happen, but it's not common in Supreme Court cases. The Supreme Court has done so in other major cases, like Brown versus Board of Education and in Citizens United. So we at LDF are now gearing up for the next round of oral argument at the Supreme Court to defend Louisiana's congressional map on October 15th. And it's undeniable that, Black Louisianians in particular have faced generations of discrimination in political representation. And we also know from even the speakers that have just spoken that fair maps can and have resulted in real change, leading to responsive leadership to address inequities in all areas of life, from healthcare to education, environmental safety, infrastructure, and more. It's really the base building block of our democracy. So At this re-argument, we will show yet again that this district was both lawful and necessary, and decades of Supreme Court precedent make it clear that districts created to remedy the type of discrimination against Black voters that are at issue in Louisiana both enforce and animate the 14th and 15th Amendments. So these amendments were the very ones that were passed during Reconstruction, specifically to root out racial discrimination and to actively enforce equal protections for disenfranchised groups, especially Black voters. That's the exact same promise that's enshrined in the Voting Rights Act. And just as the Legal Defense Fund fought in 1965 to enact the Voting Rights Act, it's now our mission to defend it in 2025. So just as one last note, I did see earlier in the chat a question that said, will there be a domino effect with other states who will follow Texas? Now, I've just gone through a litany of years of litigation to get us to this point where, voters in several states still do not have, technically, maps that they can vote under for the rest of the decade. But even so, even though this Louisiana case will be argued on October 15th, the Louisiana legislature has indicated that they will likely follow Texas's example, and they do plan to hold a special session after oral argument to consider passing a new congressional map. And that is where I will end on, and I'm excited to take your questions.
Absolutely. So first question from me, will the NAACP LDF take on Texas's maps? Can you share that with us yet, or?
I am not privy to that any of those discussions. My purview is limited to this, but I can definitely let you know that LDF is involved in any jurisdiction where Black voters are being targeted and working closely with partners on the ground who are actively engaged in these efforts to make sure that voters of color are not being diminished in these political processes.
Thank you. Elena Kuzetsnova has the first question. Elena?
Yeah, hello. Thank you, Sunita. So I have the following question. So why legislators who don't take into account Black voters and other minorities groups, they are not held accountable for their actions, especially when those redistricting cases go to the Supreme Court? In my understanding, that might be the reason that some people prefer just not to vote, and because they just don't trust the government. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's numerous ways to think about that, but I stated earlier that maps are the most fundamental building block of democracy in this country. If people do not have the recognize that their vote doesn't matter, if there are lines that are drawn in a way where they feel like their vote doesn't matter, then it's really hard to get people to turn out to vote. If our promise of democracy isn't realized at this most base level, I don't think it should be, voters should be treated in a certain way because of that. I think that means a system has failed them. And in Louisiana and Alabama, very amazingly, it was demonstrated in the 2024 elections that those new majority Black districts had the smallest voter turnout gap among Black and white voters. So it really serves to demonstrate that when you create these opportunities for voters, they really can take advantage of them and do take advantage of them. And I think the question about the second question about the legal avenues, I will just say, I think it is a little bit disheartening for people to see when they're continuously advocating for maps having success at lower court levels and it continuing until 2025. I think that that's also something that can be disheartening, but I think just the sheer fact of these victories in 2024 demonstrates that this is, once these efforts are successful, it does encourage people to come out and actually vote.
Sarah, thank you so much. There are a number of questions for you, but in the interest of time, will you please answer them in the chat?
Yes, of course. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. And we move on. Our last speaker today is Thomas Zions from the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund. Thomas, welcome.
Thank you, Sunita. So in understanding what's happening in Texas, I think it's important to begin with something Dr. Wong mentioned, and that is that the current congressional map drawn by Texas legislature in 2021 is already an attempt to maximize Republican advantage. The state of Texas legislature and governor have been in Republican hands for a number of decades, and every decade they attempt within the law, as they see it, to maximize Republican advantage. Indeed, in many of the voting rights challenges, to redistricting in Texas in the past, the state has asserted that they were not acting based on race, but acting based on trying to maximize partisan advantage. So the notion that somehow they didn't already seek to maximize Republican advantage in the current map is simply false. The only constraint that they followed was their understanding of the Voting Rights Act. And that's because, as Representative Wu mentioned, the state of Texas has been challenged decade after decade after decade successfully for its redistricting, for considering race or overly considering race, and or failing to create new seats warranted by the growth of the minority communities, particularly in Texas, the Latino community. MALDEF has been involved in all of those challenges. So there was already an attempt to maximize Republican advantage, only limited by the state's understanding of the Voting Rights Act. So in order to now gain 5 more seats from a map that was already drawn to maximize Republican advantage, they have to violate the Voting Rights Act. And that's what they are doing with the map that is being considered by the legislature and that will be signed by the governor. They are violating the Voting Rights Act in order to go beyond what they already believed to be maximized Republican advantage in the congressional map adopted in 2021. Now, that task has been made even more perilous for them because in the intervening years between the census in 2020 and today, the growth of the Latino and other communities of color in Texas has outstripped the growth of the white community. So they have to violate the Voting Rights Act even more because there is an even larger community of Latinos and other people of color in Texas that they must grapple with. And that growth, relative growth, in comparison to the white community also is true among the voting population in the state of Texas. So though they are violating the Voting Rights Act, they are acting under the pretense of seeking to comply with the law based on a letter that was sent to the Texas government by Attorney General Pam Bondi, perhaps the most unqualified Attorney General in U.S. history. In that letter, she misstated the law in a number of different respects. First of all, she interpreted a decision about what the Voting Rights Act might require as somehow meaning that even though the Fifth Circuit decided coalition districts are not required under the Voting Rights Act, that somehow meant that if you created coalition districts, it was unlawful. That is false. It is impossible not to create coalition districts in a state like Texas with significant populations of Latinos, Blacks, and Asian Americans often living in close proximity to each other. She also argued that somehow there was racial gerrymandering going on when the state of Texas, throughout the current litigation, more on that in a minute, about the current map, has asserted, apparently without real cause, that they did not consider race at all in drawing the current maps adopted in 2021, that they did this race blind. We knew that was false. But on the other hand, Bondi tells them that they engaged in racial gerrymandering, which is by definition the over-consideration of race, and they decided that they then must redraw the lines, even though they had asserted all along that they never considered race. The last point is that the United States was a part of the current challenge to the current maps prior to the Trump administration. When the Trump administration came into office, the United States decided to abandon their case against the current maps. So for Pam Bondi to then follow with a threat to sue is simply false. The United States, like all litigants in federal court, does not get to bring certain claims on a matter and then decide later on, no, we have other claims we want to bring. That's called claim splitting. It's not allowed. The United States could not sue, having abandoned their pre-existing lawsuit on the current Texas redistricting maps. The final thing I want you to know is that there will be a voting rights challenge to this map once it is adopted. Indeed, the 3 judges who just heard the trial in the case challenging the 2021 maps, indeed, we were in the middle of post-trial briefing when they decided to suspend that briefing, in part because there might be a new congressional map. But the parties have gone to those 3 judges and already requested a hearing for a preliminary injunction motion to prevent these new maps from going into effect for the 2026 election. Indeed, there will be a hearing this coming Wednesday with those 3 judges to decide when that preliminary injunction hearing will occur, whether in September or October. We are arguing for September because we need this resolved in time before the 2026 election begins in earnest. That's a critical consideration with respect to all of the other states that are now asserting that they too will redraw their lines. As we get closer and closer to the 2026 elections, and we are coming close already to the filing deadlines for folks who are interested in running for office, as we get closer and closer, it becomes harder and harder to sustain a map that does not present any opportunity for review by the courts of whether that map is in compliance with the Voting Rights Act. That's already potentially an issue in Texas. This is very late in the Texas calendar. So there will be litigation. It's already being planned against these new maps, which already violate the Voting Rights Act as the only means to take further advantage after maps adopted in 2021 that were on their face designed to maximize Republican advantage in the state of Texas. Thank you.
Thomas, a couple of questions for me before we go to the chat. Republicans are attempting to court Latinos, specifically in Texas, but also in other states. But the new maps in Texas seem to dilute the power of Latinos voting as a bloc. Could you talk about that a little bit? On the one hand, attempting to court Latino votes, but on the other hand, diluting their power to be able to get their representation.
It's a very good question. I have to say that courting Latino voters doesn't seem to be occurring under this president. His policies so far have done nothing but alienate the Latino community, which is the primary target of his immigration enforcement efforts, among other policies. That said, the state of Texas, as I mentioned, has to violate the Voting Rights Act in order to take further advantage beyond what they already did in 2021. They do that with respect to the Latino community by creating districts. Indeed, perhaps unexpectedly, they are creating the exact same number of majority Latino congressional districts, 8, as under the current map, but they are reconstructing them to pack and crack, as Representative Wu explained, but also by pairing groups of Latinos who don't turn out quite as highly as others in a majority Latino district, knowing that if turnout remains as expected, the Latino candidate of choice will not be elected in that district. Now, that could all be overturned if this ends up being a wave election, as it may be, where we see higher rates of turnout than before in midterm elections. And that's the peril, as someone else mentioned, that the Republicans face in what they are doing. But that said, the Latino community, given its size in the state of Texas, is the primary area where voting rights violations will occur by ensuring that you create majority Latino districts that in fact are unlikely to elect the candidates preferred by the Latino voting community.
Interesting. Henrietta Burrows has a question for you. Henrietta, please ask your question.
Thanks so much, Sunita. You say that Pam Bondi misstated the truth about redistricting, which assumes a lack of knowledge. However, don't you think the misstatements were intentional with a full knowledge of the facts?
So unclear. Certainly, Pam Bondi does not know voting rights. That's not her history or experience. And the Department of Justice has lost most of its voting rights experienced lawyers. So it is possible they really don't understand the law, but you are correct that this was obviously all orchestrated to provide a fig leaf for why the governor needed to call a special session to redraw the congressional map. Now, we should all be asking, why aren't they redrawing the legislative maps? If they engaged in these violations on the congressional seats, why isn't it obvious that they would have done the same with respect to the larger number of state house seats and the slightly lower number of state Senate seats? So it's all clearly orchestrated with one objective, Donald Trump's objective, to avoid what is expected otherwise to be a massive loss of seats in the House of Representatives for his party.
Thank you. Tariq Khan has a question. Tariq, will you ask your question, please?
Yeah, my question was that, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, my question was that since we have a lot of Asian American, running for, different posts, whether it's a Democrat or Republican. So this gerrymandering or this redistricting, I'm pretty sure it's going to hurt our candidates. But what can we do in order to encounter this? What measures, what steps we can take so it does not happen? What are our rights, as a Asian American or minorities especially in Texas and California, because it's happening most in these states.
Thank you, Tariq.
So let me say in Texas, what we can do is demonstrate that race is what motivated the changes that were made in the map. Now, as Dr. Wong indicated, the Asian American community is not large enough in the state of Texas or concentrated enough to create a majority Asian American congressional seat. But they are an important part of coalition districts that came through the natural redistricting process in areas like Austin. But if the Texas legislature considered race unduly in moving voters around, including API voters, then that is unconstitutional independently of the Voting Rights Act, which starts with whether you can create a majority minority district comprised of a majority from one minority group. So there are tools under the law, under the racial gerrymandering law, to demonstrate if that, in fact, the Texas legislature unduly considered the race of API voters in separating them or splitting them or moving them from one district to another. But ultimately, long term, and this gets to your larger question, it really is about demanding accountability in our redistricting processes. Dr. Wong talked about some of that. But one thing to consider is even in a state like Texas, where there are no controls and the legislature draws the lines, what we have seen more recently is federal courts deciding that the litigants on our side, including MALDEF and our clients, can't access important evidence under the doctrine of legislative privilege. So much evidence of intentional racial discrimination, of intent to dilute minority votes, has been lost to us in the current litigation because the courts have concluded that even consultations with outside third parties are somehow covered by legislative privilege, a doctrine first developed to ensure that legislators legislating on any topic would be candid in their conversations with each other. It's been expanded in such a way that we can obtain the most obvious and in many cases very public evidence of what has gone on and introduce it in court. So we can all work to introduce reforms, even at the basic level of waiving legislative privilege when it comes to redistricting, to ensure that there's greater accountability in the future when lines are drawn.
Thank you so much. I know we're a little bit over time, but I'd like to ask each of our speakers to conclude with the 30-second soundbite, their most important takeaways from our briefing. Representative Wu, if you're still on, could you give us a quick soundbite?
Here's the most basic thing. This is all happening because Americans have chosen not to pay attention to politics and to what's happening in their country. This is happening because they can, because they've been able to get away with it for so long that they feel free to now. America is headed towards true authoritarian rule. If people do not stand up, if communities around this country do not start getting ready to fight and to stand up to this at every opportunity, our country is gone.
Thank you so much. Dr. Wang.
A lot of what we've been taught in school about voting rights comes from rights at the federal level. And so if we have a naive view of where rights come from, we would care about Congress, we'd care about the Supreme Court. But right now we're seeing a significant breakdown at that level. And what that means is that to pursue these rights and to maximize what's going on in the next few years, state level governance is where it's at. And so a phrase like states' rights used to be considered very negative. That's now different. And I would say one thing I say to legally oriented people is I say it's time for you to discover your inner Federalist. And if you look in my Q&A in the chat, I say over and over again, every state is different. And so really understanding state law and state policy is going to be critical in protecting representational rights in the coming years, and then hopefully rebuilding in the years after that.
Thank you so much. Sarah, we next go to you.
I think the most important thing to remember is that fair representation isn't optional in this country. It's the right of all Americans to equal voting power. It's a central pillar of our democracy. And throughout history, and clearly to this day, voters of color have been excluded from the democratic process. And in 2025, it's clear that our fight for fair maps continues, and to ensure that every single vote counts, and to ensure that voters of color have equal opportunity and representation in this country.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And final word, Thomas.
I think it's important to note that even if we can't legally stop this transparent manipulation of the redistricting process, it can be overcome if every person who's eligible to vote, particularly in communities of color, comes out and votes in November 2026. Maximizing turnout can overcome all of the manipulation of the democratic redistricting process that is going on today.
Thank you to all our speakers and to reporters for joining us today. Next week, we will not have a briefing in view of the Labor Day weekend, and we'll see you on September 5th. Take care.